Why was the US involved in the Vietnam War? More importantly, why was North Vietnam communist in the first place? Was it only because of its proximity to China and the Soviet Union, or were there other factors involved? Let's find out. Let's start with the geography of Vietnam. The Vietnamese geography is a little similar to that of India's. It is also a peninsular region which has mountains in the north. It has a valley a little south of the mountains and then plateaus which tapers down into a deltaic region. Therefore, you have a lot of fertile land in the south, whereas in the north you have agricultural land, but it is not suitable for agriculture that can produce a lot of income. Therefore, you have a lot of subsistence farming in the northern parts of Vietnam, whereas in the south you have sufficient fertile land to produce a lot of surplus that can be infused into innovations to improve productivity as well as to diversify industries. Topography and terrain also results in various other consequences, one of which is transportational infrastructure. So the kind of transportational infrastructure that the French colonizers who had colonized Vietnam until 1945 are able to build in the south of Vietnam is much greater in volume and quality than in the northern parts of Vietnam. And it isn't just transportational infrastructure, it's all kinds of infrastructure. So what does this lead to? It leads to a situation where the economy of the south is doing much better, is flourishing in comparison to that of the north. This results in a situation where the north requires a centralized government, or a government that can centralize its resources and, or rather nationalize its resources and use it in a centralized manner, deploy it in a centralized manner and distribute it to regions that require it the most, that is the northern parts of Vietnam. Now in 1945, after the Vietnamese win their independence, the French try to re-establish the colonial rule, which starts off the First Indochina War in 1946. Now the war ends in 1954 with the Geneva Accords, with the region divided into two nations, the north under a communist and socialist regime, whereas the south under a regime backed by the Western powers. Now this peace is soon disrupted with the eruption of the Second Indochina War in 1955, which goes on from 1955 to 1975. This time the US support to the French forces or the South Vietnamese government is a lot more explicit. Again, this is a time when the Cold War has gotten a lot more intense and the opposition to the communist ideologies by the United States is a lot more stronger. When in 1965 the United States finally sends in its troops, but even then Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese government slowly or maintain their resistance and slowly gain their upper hand, finally resulting in the United States withdrawing its troops in 1975. Hence, the North Vietnamese government, which is a communist socialist regime backed by China and the USSR, finally emerged victorious, reunifying the whole of Vietnam. Even after reunification, the country continues to see multiple economic hurdles. One of the reasons for which, of course, is the aftermath of two wars spanning over almost 3 decades. And finally, the economy of the country starts to turn around the 1980s when the government finally starts to take up market-oriented reforms and market-oriented policies called Doi Moi.